Okay, so this video is going to be discussing the similarities and differences between cellular respiration and photosynthesis. So hopefully by the end of this video you'll be able to see the comparison on your own. So to begin, it'd be good to start in a very general sense. So we can refer to this table I've made over here. So the most general comparison you can really make is regarding the formula. So here we have the formula for cellular respiration, and here we have it for photosynthesis. Here we can see our very first comparison. The reactants on the cellular respiration side are actually the products on photosynthesis, and vice versa with the other side. So as you can see, these equations are actually opposites of each other. The next comparison we can make is the actual delta G value of both equations. Cellular respiration has a negative delta G value. Photosynthesis, on the other hand, has a positive delta G value. This is regarding the release of energy. Cellular respiration releases its energy into the environment, so it's an exergonic reaction. Photosynthesis, on the other hand, stores the energy within itself, therefore it is an endergonic reaction. So that's a very general comparison we can make right off the bat. To go into more detail, cellular respiration is actually in 4 stages: glycolysis, pyruvate oxidation, citric acid cycle, and the electron transport chain. Photosynthesis, on the other hand, is in 2 stages: light dependent, light independent. So there we have a difference right there: 4 stages, 2 stages. We can also compare these in terms of where ATP is formed. ATP in cellular respiration is formed in glycolysis, citric acid cycle, and the electron transport chain. In photosynthesis, on the other hand, ATP is only formed in light-dependent reactions. We can also compare what this ATP is used for,
and you'll be seeing that later on in the video.
So now we can focus really on the cycles themselves in cellular respiration and photosynthesis, so we can compare those two more in depth. So the first stage in cellular respiration was glycolysis. Here we have the 6-carbon molecule of glycolysis, and as 2 ATP come in, after a few more processes with some enzymes, some rearranging of the molecule, it becomes into the 2 pyruvate molecules. I'm not going to explain this too much just because it's not really a fundamental concept that needs to be compared, but we do know that the payoff in glycolysis is 4 ATP and 2 NADH. So here we have pyruvate oxidation. Pyruvate oxidation is using this pyruvate molecule, and our final product here is an acetyl-CoA. Citric acid cycle we can focus on a little bit just because this can be easily compared to in our photosynthesis reaction. So here we have the citric acid cycle. This is the acetyl group that we had from the pyruvate oxidation, and this is an oxaloacetate molecule. Together they form the citrate molecule, and this is where the cycle occurs. The key to this cycle is that after this process, oxaloacetate must be formed again to once again join with the acetyl group for this cycle to occur again. Here we see NADH being formed, CO2 being shaved off, ATP being formed. A key thing to remember here is that CO2 is being taken away or shaved off. You'll see why this is important later on when comparing it to the photosynthesis processes. And here we have the electron transport chain. This is also very important in terms of being compared to photosynthesis. So this I can explain also in a bit more detail. Just like the citric acid cycle, we have NADH giving its electrons here to complex 1, and FADH, which was formed in the previous cycles, giving its electrons to complex 2. These processes occur. Protons are also being pumped across the membrane. These are entering through complex 1, 3, and 4. As the electrons are given away to the carriers, which we can see here and here, the protons are pumped out. These pumped out ions create a hydrogen-proton concentration gradient.
Electron's main
function is to come down here, and that is to reduce oxygen to create H2O. And because of this flow of electrons to create H2O, as I mentioned, the proton gradient is formed. This proton gradient is actually what powers the ATP synthase. Because there's a higher concentration here and a lower concentration here, they want to diffuse over, therefore powering this. This ATP synthase is what forms ATP. So now that we know the basics of electron transport chain, we can compare this to light-dependent reactions in photosynthesis. Right off the bat, we can see the very similar structure of the light-dependent reaction in the electron transport chain. I'm also not going to explain this in too much detail, but just the process or the steps that apply to our comparison between this and the electron transport chain. A difference that we can note right off the bat is that the light-dependent reactions rely on the sunlight. Therefore, a photon here is needed to begin this reaction. Water splitting enzyme is splitting this water. Here we have the electrons from the water going in, and we are left with the protons here on the side. This can be a similarity noted right away because here we have the proton gradient being formed once again. Unlike the electrons in the electron transport chain, whose main focus was to reduce the oxygen at the end to create water, these electrons' main focus is to enter this NADP reductase. This is going to be forming NADPH. Just like the electron transport chain, as the electrons go through, their energy levels are going down. As the energy levels are going down, H ions are pumped across the membrane from this side. This is also similar just in the way that these are being pumped across a membrane as they were in an electron transport chain. Another key difference quickly before we move on to the final step of this is that all H2O is being broken down here, while in the electron transport chain it is being formed. The final part of this that is very, very similar to the electron transport chain is this ATP synthase. Here, as I mentioned before, we have the high proton concentration gradient, and this once again is what powers this ATP synthase, just as in cellular respiration. This creates the ATP. And now this is what powers our Calvin cycle. So the Calvin cycle doesn't really happen in one turn with just a single starting molecule. It actually needs 3 of each for a complete turn or a complete production of a G3P molecule. So that's just some knowledge to have on the side. So here we start with 3 RUBP molecules and 3 carbon dioxides coming in. This forms the 6,3-PGAs. This is what forms the G3Ps. Although 5 need to go on to remake the RUBP, we have 1 G3P left set aside. This is what is used to create the glucose molecule. We can now compare this to the citric acid cycle in cellular respiration. As you can see, the very first thing to notice is that they're both in a cycle form. Here we have the oxaloacetate molecule that needs to be remade in order for the cycle to restart. In the Calvin cycle, we have the RUBP that needs to be remade in order for the cycle to start. So in both cycles, we have a starting molecule that needs to be remade in order for this to go on. A key difference we can note in this is that in the citric acid cycle, we have CO2 being shed off. In the Calvin cycle, we have CO2 being added in. So now to sum all this up, the first difference that you can spot right off the bat is that cellular respiration occurs in the mitochondria, while the photosynthesis occurs in the chloroplast. So cellular respiration is really in living things, animals, humans, etc., etc. Photosynthesis is in plants and certain types of cellular respiration, like I mentioned before, has 4 stages, while photosynthesis has 2. Although ATP is formed in both, cellular respiration is using this ATP for other body type processes, or releasing the energy, while the light-dependent reaction that creates the ATP is having the ATP go straight to the light-independent. This can go hand in hand, as you can see glucose is being broken down in cellular respiration, and glucose is being built up in photosynthesis. Another key similarity that's quite obvious is that both processes use enzymes. That's self-explanatory. So to go into more detail about the stages quickly, we compared the electron transport chain and the light-dependent reactions. The similarities we found was the high proton concentration that powered the ATP synthase and the electron flow itself. In the electron transport chain, this was to reduce oxygen to make water. In the light-dependent reactions, this was to power the NADP reductase. Another difference, as I mentioned water before, is that the electron transport chain was forming water, while the light-dependent reactions rely on the breaking up of water. We also compared the citric acid cycle and the Calvin cycle. Here you can see the cyclic process being a very key similarity. A difference we notice is that the citric acid cycle is shedding CO2, while the Calvin cycle is bringing in CO2. A last thing to make note of is about NAD. NAD is a key molecule because it is used both in photosynthesis and cellular respiration. However, in cellular respiration, it becomes NADH. NAD continuously formed NADH, and this acted as an energy source, so it stored the ATP which was converted through in the electron transport chain to become ATP, similar to FADH2. In photosynthesis, NAD became NADPH. NADPH was formed in the light-dependent reactions and continued on into the Calvin cycle. This was really used to reduce the 3-PGAs, which in the end made the G3P molecule. And this basically sums up the similarities and differences that I noted between cellular respiration and photosynthesis. I hope this was a learning experience for you and you're now able to see the comparison and such for yourself. Thank you very much. Yay!